opportunity to open up this conversation amongst our congregation. As we deepen into, we've got a lot of ground to cover in this conversation over the next hour. But fear not, there will be a second session. So if something comes up over the course of the next hour that you feel like there's more to be said, there's something we need to talk about, in 2 weeks we will have part 2 of this dialogue. And I do want to say that over the course of the next 2 weeks, if something comes up and you'd like to have a one-on-one, please feel free to reach out. We want to make sure everybody has a chance to have questions around this subject answered, because it's such an important topic. So as we open up this conversation, I'd like to ground us in community and what it is that we are doing here together. So would you join me in some opening words for today's session? You can find it on your handout and also up here on the slide. We are grateful for the gift of our lives and the gift of other people in our lives. Each of us is created with dignity and worth. We are called to love one another and to do nothing to others that we would find hateful to ourselves. We honor the many ways that people live and love. Our common life is enriched when queer, transgender, bisexual, lesbian, and gay people can come out, sharing the gifts of their sexual orientation and gender identity. True justice flourishes when all people can live and flourish. We suffer when LGBTQ people are oppressed, excluded, or shamed by religious people who overlook the fundamental call to love one another. Love does not exclude. We are all worthy. May we work to build a world where all people are celebrated and loved. We celebrate sexual and gender diversity as a blessing that enriches us all. Amen. So, as we begin this conversation, I'll be grounding this conversation in our identity as a church, who we are as First Parish in Lincoln, and we'll move on to some conversations, some definitions in the event that this is a new subject, so we can have some common language that we're using together. But I do want to say that we are going to open up for dialogue, and sometimes when we talk about subjects that are new or difficult or maybe cause some doubt or uncertainty, it can be challenging to engage respectfully in conversation. And so I thought I'd just remind us that we come into this space as a community that is bound by our commitment to one another, to be in relationship with one another, and to do that, it's helpful to ground conversations like this in a community agreement. So I put together some community agreements for us to hold to as we open up this dialogue. We use I statements and speak from our own experiences. We share time and space equitably. We lean into discomfort and uncertainty, knowing that's how we grow. We give each other grace, knowing that the work of living our values is hard and we will all mess up at some point. And we seek first to understand and assume good intent while also acknowledging impact. So if we say or do anything that causes another person harm, we commit to working through it, to acknowledging that harm, and to doing better. And so I ask you all, as we open up this conversation, are these agreements that we feel we can hold together in community today? Yes. Is there anything else that you feel should be added to these community agreements in order to feel like you are able to be fully present in this conversation?
It's not confidential.
It's not confidential. This conversation, thank you for bringing that up. I removed that from our typical community engagement agreements because this is being recorded. And so this is a conversation that will be recorded. If there's anything that you feel, you know what, actually, I don't know if this is a space that I should be saying this, particularly if you're talking about somebody else. Just bear in mind that this is not a confidential conversation. This is not something that's happening like in a small group sort of setting. If you'd like to have more conversations where you are able to kind of dig in a way that would allow for that sort of deep work, we can look into that, but that's not what this is. So, yes, Joan.
I know in meditation we have a sharing where we don't comment on what each other says. Is that what we would do here? Or, because sometimes if you say, I don't agree with John or Sue, that's sort of a judgment on what they're saying.
I think this is a conversation where we are going to perhaps disagree with one another, but it's how we hold those disagreements that I'm more concerned about. So if someone says something that perhaps is something you disagree with, we are first holding that desire to understand what they're saying and believe good intent, while also naming perhaps there was something that was said that caused harm. And so we can name harm and name difference while also believing the best in one another and holding to that value of seeking to understand and to lean into that discomfort. So I hope that's an answer that makes some sort of sense. All right, so moving on, thank you all for that agreement. Let's root this conversation in some community identity work, right? We've done a lot of work as a congregation in naming who we are, in creating these community statements of identity, of our values, of who we are aspiring to be. You might hear us every single week call ourselves an open and welcoming community church. We're going to get into what that actually means in a little bit, because those words aren't random. They have very specific meanings in the denominations that we're a part of. As a UCC, United Church of Christ, and a UUA, Unitarian Universalist Association church, we are associated with both denominations, and the terms open and welcoming have meaning in those denominations. So we've ascribed that identity to ourselves, of what those terms mean. We've also, for generations, said that we go forth into the world, into our communities, with that calling to affirm each person's dignity. This is inherent to who we are, and it's been inherent to who we are for generations, right? In the recent years, we have had these vision statements and value statements developed by wonderful groups of hardworking people who've listened to you and said, what is it about First Parish that makes you want to be here? What is it about First Parish that makes us First Parish? And some of the big ideas that we have held on to that have come up time and time again in those conversations have made it into our vision statements, like to be an open and inclusive community that learns to trust and work with each other as we celebrate, grieve, grow, support, and serve together. So being an open and inclusive community is part of our vision of who First Parish is. To be a source of hope and positive impact in our communities, our region, and beyond, by affirming the dignity of all peoples and caring for the living earth. This is our vision of who we are as a community. And our mission statement, many different pieces, but this one particularly relevant today. It is our mission as a church, and we've all voted to affirm, those of us who are members have voted to affirm, this is our mission as a church, to pursue social justice by learning, understanding how and where we can make a difference, and then acting. So this is integral, and it's come up time and time again. So some might say, we've said this, right? Why do we have to talk about this specifically? Isn't it already there in our documents? Isn't it already there? We're an open and welcoming church. Why do we have to specifically talk about transgender and non-binary inclusion in the church? And I want to raise up a figure. This is Marsha P. Johnson, and she often said that the P stands for pay it no mind. Marsha P. Johnson was a foremother in the queer liberation movement of the 60s and 70s. And she was someone who was a transgender woman of color who supported trans and non-binary and queer folks who were living on the margins, living on the streets. She made sure folks had housing. She made sure folks had community protection, support. She supported sex workers and was in all of those communities herself, but she was a foremother of the movement that eventually led to Stonewall, which was that rebellion that really kicked off what we now call Pride, right? It started in June 1969, I believe, that really initiated this whole movement of queer liberation. Unfortunately, what happened in the aftermath of that, even though it was a coalition of queer folks of all different LGBTQ identities that participated in that pushback against the oppression that they were receiving in New York City. Unfortunately, the folks that ended up at the center of that story in later years, in the center of Pride in later years, were just gay and lesbian people and somewhat bisexual folks. And transgender and non-binary folks, genderqueer folks who were a part of this movement from the very beginning, like Marsha P. Johnson, got pushed to the wayside in favor of other parts of the community that were deemed more palatable, more respectable, someone that could actually be invited into a space, perhaps, and fly under the radar. And what Marsha P. Johnson said, you know what, no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. We've got to be specific when we talk about what open and welcoming means. We've got to be specific and name the oppressions of folks who are on the margins. And what we mean when we say open and welcoming has to be relevant for folks who are being especially targeted. In a day like today, even in the last couple of days, more and more legislation coming out in all different corners of this country that are targeting transgender and non-binary folks. And so for someone like Marsha P. Johnson, no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. And for someone like Audre Lorde, a Black lesbian woman who we did a lot of work with, reading her work this last fall, one of my favorite quotes by her, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own." So even if someone's womanhood is different, even if someone's identity is different from what you or I or others might identify with, our liberation, our dignity, our openness, and our welcomingness is bound up together. And I am not welcome if Marsha P. Johnson is not welcome. I am not welcome. My dignity is bound up with hers. And so that's why we're being specific here. That's why we are naming the fact that trans and non-binary folks are beloved. They are important and valued parts of our community, and they are part of our community already. There are trans and non-binary folks within our congregation, our friends, our family members, our neighbors, and our extended community. And if we are going to be a truly open and welcoming congregation, we need to be specific in what we mean when it comes to folks in all across the spectrum of the LGBTQ community. I also want to, in the terms of why are we having this conversation, specifically focus on our children. There was a study done, and I have it on your handout there as well, and it's listed in a document called From Transitioning to Inclusion. And this quote says, in a recent Human Rights Campaign survey of trans and gender variant youth, only 8% rated their church or place of worship as very accepting, with 22% rating their place of worship as not at all accepting. But here's the real piece that I want to name here. 53% of youth surveyed said they did not know whether their own place of worship was accepting of LGBTQ people. And my point today is this: our kids should know. When they come up through our RE program, which is baking into its very foundation the understanding of the belovedness of trans and non-binary folks, and is trying to be an inclusive space for our trans and non-binary kids and their friends. When they come up through that RE program and then step foot into the sanctuary, and they step foot into this physical space, they should not have to say, is it different from what I experienced up the hill? Is this, are the adults in my community reflecting what I've been told my whole life this place is? So that's why we're doing this, because this is important, because trans and non-binary folks are being especially targeted in our culture today, and because our kids deserve it. They are owed this work from us to have these difficult conversations. And so we begin. In order to kind of have a starting point, I want to do some definitions work so we have a common language. That being said, language is hard, words are hard, and it's ever evolving. So terms that were once used to describe members of different communities and different experiences might not be used anymore, right? Or might be considered to have some baggage that shouldn't be used anymore. Or maybe certain words are coming from an outside community, and so certain members of the community don't resonate with it because it's not coming from them. All that to say, here are some terms that we can use in some shared language to engage in this conversation. We're going to walk through them in a second. But these are terms that are used in this conversation to make sense of it today. That doesn't mean that these terms have always been used. And basically, LGBTQ folks, and specifically trans and non-binary folks, have been around for the entirety of the human experience. For all generations, these folks have existed. And just because these terms might be becoming more popular now because of the ways that medical communities or other sorts of communities are doing work to try and be inclusive, this language is coming out of that. That doesn't mean that these folks have not always existed. They've always existed, and these are some terms that we are using in different ways today in order to try and talk about this, right? So, here are some terms. Let's dive in. And note that I pulled these definitions directly from some different sources, the Human Rights Campaign, GLAAD, Planned Parenthood, but all of these definitions are in agreement with modern standard definitions that you might, if you were to go to a medical community, medical journal. These are terms that are basically in alignment, but I was drawing from these particular sources because I like the phrasing and the ways that it was talked about. But this is common, general terminology. So when we talk about sex or assigned sex, this is what we mean. We're talking about the fact that infants, when a human being is born, they are assigned a, quote, sex at birth, male or female, that's based on the external appearance of their anatomy. Now, sex is way more complicated than what a doctor can see when looking at an infant. There's genetic, there's chromosomal factors, there's hormonal factors, there's all sorts of pieces that are a part of our biological makeup. But basically what happens is when an infant is born, the doctor, the nurse looks at the infant and assigns them into one or two categories most of the time. However, sometimes when a doctor or nurse looks at an infant, they're not able to assign them a gender because of some ambiguous genitalia. And so this is an experience that actually affects about 2% of the population. It's more common than identical twins in the human population. It's about as common as folks with green eyes or red hair. It is a common human experience of sex. And the fact that this is an ancient experience of humanity just goes to show that for millennia, sex has never actually been binary. It's always been a spectrum, and there's been different names that have been used to discuss it. Today, that term that's often used to discuss that experience is intersex. So folks who don't neatly, based off of visual characteristics or based off of their chromosomal makeup, fit into that binary are born with an intersex trait. Gender identity. Gender identity has to do with one's internal understanding, their own deeply held knowledge of their gender. So everybody has a gender identity. So for most people, that gender identity of that internal sense of knowing who you are, oftentimes that aligns with what the doctor put on your birth certificate, right? But oftentimes it doesn't align. And so for transgender people, their gender identity or their internal knowing of who they are doesn't align with what is typically understood to be qualities, characteristics, the identity of the sex which they were assigned at birth. And so that is gender identity, for their experience of gender identity. For other folks, and we're going to get to in a bit, cisgender people, their experience of their gender identity, their internal knowing of who they are, does align with what was assigned to them at birth. So the key here is that gender identity is not something that you can look at someone and know based off of what you see. It's their internal, it's all of our internal knowledge of who we are, what it means to all the different elements that make up who we are. And then gender expression is then how we express our sense of gender. And it could be different from one day to the next, right? But this is external manifestations of gender that are expressed through a person's name, pronouns, clothing, haircuts, voice, behavior, the way that folks are putting themselves out into the world to be perceived by others. And so society sometimes classifies these different cues as traditionally quote-unquote masculine or quote-unquote feminine, but our ideas of that change over time. For example, just the colors pink and blue. At one point in time, pink was considered to be an inherently masculine color, and blue was considered to be an inherently feminine color. And so for generations, little boys were dressed up in pink and little girls were dressed up in blue, and eventually that swapped at one point. And so our sense of what attributes are gendered as masculine or what attributes are gendered as feminine evolves. It's a cultural phenomenon, and what it looks like here in this place in Lincoln in 2023, it's going to look very different across the country, across the world, and over the course of time. And so gender expression is, what does it mean for me today to express my gender? And it could look like, one thing one day and another thing another day. And then sexual orientation, I want to name that this describes an individual's enduring physical, emotional, romantic, spiritual attraction to another person. And gender identity and sexual orientation are not the same, right? These are all categories that we're using, or terms that are like, we're trying to break up our identity into these different categories, right? But essentially, there's many factors that make up who we are. We are holistic beings. And how we identify as in terms of our gender is different from how we identify in terms of who we experience attraction to. So here's an image that you've got in your handout that, similar sorts of images are used in OWL or in other sorts of programs in order to teach kids and kids of all ages, including the kids in this room is what I'm saying, what these different categories are. And so all of these pieces make up who we are. Our gender identity is our personal understanding of who we are and how we identify. This can be boy, girl, neither, or both. Our bodies, we've got our sex that we're assigned at birth. So babies can't tell us our gender identity. So doctors make a guess based off of body parts. And doctors usually guess male or female, but that's not the only way that a baby can be born. How we then express all of these components comes out in our gender expression, and then how we experience attraction to others is our sexual orientation. So at this point, does anybody have any questions or comments, or I want to open it up for dialogue at this stage in the journey here. And unfortunately, we don't have a mic in here today, so I invite you, if you're going to speak, to project. Any questions? Anybody want to raise anything about what we've said so far? Thank you. Yes, Adam.
I heard you today, and I've heard other people use the term genderqueer,
Yes.
which I assume is different from being queer in relation to sexual orientation.
It's a great question, and we're going to get that's coming up soon. But queer is sort of an umbrella term which can refer to gender identity. It can also refer to sexual orientation. So it's really that's one of the reasons why folks it resonates with a lot of folks, because it really, it's fluid, right? It can be your identity, it can be your sexuality, it can be neither or both. It's some way in which you are not in alignment with the mainstream, right? And so if you're wanting to be specific, you might say genderqueer, right? So that's specifically referring to the ways in which someone is outside of the mainstream gender binary, and that their experience of their gender doesn't fit neatly into those categories.
Yeah, I
Kit.
just want to say I have such appreciation for the way language continues to evolve in the queer community, and the way in which new terms like genderqueer, non-binary, transgender is another one of those umbrella terms. One term that I particularly like is gender creative, and I hear sometimes parents of queer, non-binary, trans kids use that term, and I think I like it because it feels empowering, and also acknowledging the fluidity and that experimentation may be part of someone's journey, and for some people they feel a really internal sense their whole life. For other people, anyway, just
Yeah.
offering gender creative as another term I like.
Love that one. I've also heard like gender diverse, right? So there's recognition of the diversity within gender, and one's experience of their gender is evolving, right? And so there's lots of different ways that could be named, right? Thank you, Kit. I love that one. A couple more terms to look at. We have this term you might hear, the gender binary, which is the idea, the philosophy that there is only two genders and that each is solidly fixed, it's biologically based, and it's attached to what you are then supposed to be in the world, right? The gender binary, there exists only male and female, and it looks a particular way to be male or particular way to be female. That means something of how you show up in the world. Now, the binary gender system, while predominant in this says most cultures, but I'll say many cultures, and I'll say perhaps it is mainstream in our culture, right? It's not the only model of gender that exists. Historically, more nuanced, more varied understandings of gender have existed throughout the course of human history and still exist today in other cultures. Oftentimes, we might hear language around like the terms of transgender and non-binary today because these terms are becoming more and more, more people are becoming aware of them in our culture. Someone might say, well, this is just a trend. Well, not really, because actually, throughout the course of human history and continuing today in different cultures, there has always been a recognition of gender as a spectrum. And so the idea of a gender spectrum is different from a gender binary idea. So it's the idea that gender is a complex aspect of oneself, and it's influenced by all those different elements that we've just talked about, like sex, gender expression, gender identity. And each of those pieces or elements that make up who we are can be represented as a spectrum and not a binary. And so all of the ways that these interact within ourselves leads to an infinite set of outcomes of how a person can show up in the world, right? And I want to say that you might see a QR code in your handout. Here's a map that's been put together by PBS Independent Lens, I think is, of some examples of different cultures currently and historically that have demonstrated the existence of a gender spectrum. And so I encourage you to scan that QR code if on your own time, look up some of these examples of people all over the world today who name the reality that gender exists on the spectrum and have very different ways of understanding gender than what we might in mainstream Western culture understand gender to be. Yes?
I see you have Iran in there.
Yes. Now, I did not go through in my prep every single one, and I didn't look at Iran. But I would recommend doing some research on this. And I bring this to our attention so that we can just collectively understand that this is not a trend. This is not something that our kids are just trying to do to be cool. This is something that's been inherent to the human experience for generations, and particularly in non-white communities. And gender in white communities has historically been a very racialized category, right? So we can just also bring in that factor, right? That what it means to be a white woman, right? What it means to be a woman for a white person is very racialized and has all, that's a whole other conversation, but I also want to bring it in here as well. Just to name, gender diversity is part of the human expression. Yep, Miranda and then Joan.
I see that there are at least 3 purple pins on the United States there, and I'm wondering if they are related to some Native American
Yes.
tribes, because I've read that in certain Native American tribes over history,
Yep.
people who are on the spectrum who don't identify as one
Yes.
or the other are actually highly revered in their tribe because they are
Absolutely.
considered to have special access to both for a spectrum of
Yes.
knowledge or something.
Absolutely. These pins here are all related to indigenous communities and Native American nations. So for example, like the Navajo Nation has particular terms that they use in order to discuss the reality of someone who might appear to be male but embodies femininity, right? And vice versa, or someone who experiences the expression of both simultaneously, right? A term that is used often to describe indigenous trans or non-binary experience is two-spirit. It's a modern term. If you ever see it in the acronym LGBTQ and you see 2S, that is in reference to two-spirit. It's a modern term that is used and has been claimed by some indigenous communities to describe this ancient expression of gender that is different in different tribal nations. So there's not one two-spirit experience across all Native American communities. It looks different in different nations and in different tribes, but that is another umbrella term that you might see, and that's what's being referenced there. Joan and then Ben.
Okay, I have a couple of things. One of them is Terry Cummings, who was our trans minister here. And it was so wonderful to me to get to know her and hear her talk about when she was even a little child, she definitely felt she was a woman. And I think knowing somebody is a great gift because it really makes it very human.
Absolutely.
And the other thing is gender binary. This is talking about gender identity and not sexual orientation. Is that correct?
So the gender binary is specifically talking about the idea that there's only 2 categories for humans to fall into, both in terms of our physical, biological makeup or assigned sex, as well as the gender that is inherently connected to our physical makeup. In the gender binary, the idea is there's only male and female, and that means certain things. Now, someone might be particularly believing in a gender binary, but they might believe that they might be affirming of gay and lesbian and bisexual folks. And this is very common in like the modern gender critical movement. If you're familiar with some might call them TERFs or trans exclusionary radical feminists. There is a whole movement within that branch of feminism that is against transgender and non-binary experiences. And unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that J.K. Rowling is extremely committed to that philosophy of the gender binary and is gender critical in her approach. So very discriminatory against transgender, non-binary
I would
people.
think gender binary would free us all. You know, if it didn't have to be so rigid about who's what, I think it would be very freeing for everybody.
Right, so this idea of a gender spectrum, like to release oneself from that idea that I have to be a certain way because of my physical makeup, what a gift to the world. And if we were to embrace that idea that gender is a spectrum and we wholeheartedly incorporate that into the way that we live and treat one another, what a gift, right? And what a loss when we try and keep ourselves in boxes. And I think that what you're saying about knowing someone who has that different gender experience, I think we are all better for having members of the LGBTQ community in our lives, in our congregation, right? Those of us who are coming from a cisgender, which we'll get to in a second, and heterosexual experience, our lives are enriched, right? That was our opening words. Our lives, our community is enriched when we are open to the experience of gender diversity. So, Ben, yes.
So when you say gender spectrum,
Yes.
I think of a line with, male over here, female over here. But I think that, or it's the question more, I have the sense that some people are saying, wait a minute, I don't want to be put on that line anywhere. I'm
Over there, yeah. Absolutely. And I think one might, rather than a line, think of it as, I don't know, a prism hanging in a church window, in which people are coming to be a part of a community, and everyone has a different sense of the divine, and it all refracts in different ways and then comes out in this beautiful rainbow. Similarly, we all come to this world and into this community specifically with different experiences of sex and gender expression, and we are all more beautiful because of the rainbow that comes through that prism of our community, and the different gender expressions and the gender spectrum that we are incarnating. Thank you. So, a couple more terms before I want to open up to then the question of what does inclusion and belonging look like for trans and non-binary folks here in our congregation. So be thinking about, so if someone were to be trans and non-binary and walked into our community, what might their experience look like? And I just want to name again that trans and non-binary folks are here and walking into our congregation. So that is not a someday down the line. We are already a community in which that expresses this diversity. So, but be thinking about what does inclusion and belonging look like specifically here. So again, more terms, some adjectives for us to know. Cisgender, or cis, you might hear it shortened as cis, is the term used to describe individuals whose gender identity or expression aligns with those that are typically associated with the sex that is assigned to them at birth. So if, for example, I was assigned female at birth, my experience of my gender identity is I resonate with womanhood. I resonate with that gender that has been assigned to me. I am a cis woman. I'm a cisgender woman. Right? And then transgender or trans is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or expression is different from the cultural expectations that are based off of the sex that they were assigned at birth. So someone who does not resonate with that sex that was assigned to them at birth and the gender that is typically associated with it could use the term trans. Again, it's an umbrella term, and some folks that have a gender diverse experience might use a different term, but generally speaking, for the purposes of this conversation, transgender is a term that we can use to describe that difference, that the fact that someone is born and is assigned something and that doesn't resonate with their experience. And so these terms, cisgender and transgender, have their origins in Latin prefixes, cis meaning on this side of, and trans meaning across from, or on the other side of, meaning I am cis, I am on this, I am in alignment with what I was assigned at birth, and trans meaning I am transgressing, I'm on the other side of what was expected of me based off of what I was assigned at birth. Right? And then we've got this another umbrella term, non-binary, which is a term used by folks who experience their gender identity as an and or expression as falling outside of those two male and female categories. And so it's an umbrella term that might be used by someone who identifies with both very strongly or neither very strongly, or perhaps someone that is gender fluid, meaning one day their experience of their gender might look one way and another day it might look and feel a different way. So there are so many different ways to understand gender, and I thought I had another bit here. I think I put it in the handout. Yeah, so some related terms might be agender, gender fluid, gender queer, right? And so again, non-binary is an umbrella term, and sometimes folks might as a non-binary person, identify also with the term transgender. Sometimes they won't. So again, it's just very diverse, and the terms that people use that resonate with their own experience is just going to be different from person to person. And it's all about listening to someone and how they experience themselves, identify what words resonate and are meaningful for them in their understanding of who they are. Right? Couple more terms and then we're going to transition. Well, queer. An umbrella term, that was not intentional, by the way. An umbrella term that describes sexual and gender identities other than straight and cisgender. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, they all, LGBTQ folks potentially could identify with the term queer, or maybe someone who identifies with one of those terms doesn't like it, right? So queer is sometimes used to express that sexuality and gender can be complicated. It's messy, and not any one term can necessarily capture everybody, right? It can change over time. It might not neatly fit into easy categories, right? And so it's important to note that while at one point in time queer was used as a slur, and some LGBTQ folks might not like it still as a result, there is a significant movement within the community that has reclaimed that term as a term of empowerment and self-determination. And so a good number of folks in the LGBTQ community might not necessarily like any of the other terms, but queer is what really feels right to them. And there's a whole movement of, like I said, queer liberation. I've used it in that context. Queer theology is a discipline in the study of theology. If you're in seminary, you might take a queer theology class like I did. And so that is where that term's coming from. I think intersex, we've already talked about, someone that who with one or more innate characteristics like genitals, internal reproductive organs, chromosomes that fall outside of that strict biological quote-unquote binary. And so these variations are also sometimes referred to as differences of sex development. And it can be something that happens over time. Like someone might be born and it's very clear that this person is intersex, and it might be something that doesn't show up or make itself manifest until puberty because of different hormones that start to make them realize that they're experiencing puberty differently than what has been assigned to them or what was expected of them based on their assigned sex. And some folks live their whole lives as intersex and never know, right? And it's based off of just the diversity of internal organs, chromosomes, etc., hormones, etc. So, and then lastly, transition. This is a term that is used. It's a process, or the processes by which some people strive to more closely align in their lives with their internal knowledge of gender, with its outward manifestation. So someone might socially transition by saying, could you please call me by this name, right? And they might give you their name that they've chosen. They might say, here are my pronouns, right? I'm non-binary, and so I'd like it if you were to use they, them when referring to me, right? So maybe in the clothes that they wear, perhaps their gender expression, they might shift that a bit in order to feel like it's in alignment with their gender identity. So that's a social transition. And then there's gender affirming care, which some trans and non-binary folks do seek out and others don't. So there's a variety of, within trans and non-binary experience, there's a variety of feelings of how to adjust and bring their physical body in alignment with their gender identity. And it's a beautiful and wonderful thing that should be available to everybody that wants it. And also, it's not the only way to be valid in your identity as a trans or non-binary person. So it doesn't have to be someone's desire in order to be a valid trans person to say, I want to seek gender affirming care. So that was a lot, and I want to wrap up there. Much more to say. But now I want to open up for dialogue around what do you all think in making our community, living into our open and welcoming identity. How do you think we might be doing when it comes to trans and non-binary folks, and how might we live into it more today? Peter.
I'd like to say, first of all, thank you for all of this wonderful collection of a lot of information. And it's so important that we do something really meaningful on this topic. My second child, Tristan, who sang in the choir with us for quite a few years, is now 35 years old and transitioned, started on it really formally only about 3 years ago, living now in North Carolina. And it is so difficult to be going through all of this stuff. I mean, the world looks at you in such a nasty way. There are some people who are just so amazingly angry and spiteful and hurting, punch you, knock you to the ground, all kinds of stuff. But Tristan is now Nicole, and is doing well, is steady, and is part of a community where there are people who look after each other, and she is now doing that for others, which is a wonderful thing to do. And that would be one of the suggestions that I would make, is if we can have a formal sort of understanding, try and get people who can be missionaries on the topic to help with others. And we all know that we love doing that kind of thing, helping homeless and going to food kitchens and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I can't tell you how important it is and how scary it can be for people who are in this work.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for sharing your story and Nicole's story. Edwin.
So cognitively, I think it will come in accepting.
Sorry, could you project a bit more? Sorry, Edwin.
Yeah,
If you
so
could
I
come
think,
closer, some folks
yeah.
are having,
I think,
if you'd like. Thank you, Edwin.
I think I am intellectually. I think I'm open and welcoming and embracing all all persuasions, so to speak. But I'm mindful of the fact that I grew up in a biased environment and culture, which might make me not practice what I'm supposed to do to be truly supportive and embracing. So I think it's a challenge to me and maybe others. How do we truly be supportive under those circumstances where we might be biased without knowing that we are actually biased? And then in this topic, it's not easy to talk to someone and say, by the way, can you tell me your persuasion, sexual orientation, and so it's a very complicated thing, and I just want to ask, what's the best way to be supportive without offending anyone and all that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Edwin, for that. And I also want to name that that's my experience as well. I was raised in a context that was very much against affirmation of the entire LGBTQ community. So the theology, the theological and spiritual tradition that I come from was very deeply rooted in homophobia and transphobia. And so it's a journey, right? So when we all come to this point in our lives where we realize that we've internalized some harmful and discriminatory ideas, we have to acknowledge that we've internalized it, and we say, I want to do better, I want to be inclusive, and then we go on the journey. That doesn't mean that now all of a sudden we've snapped our fingers and now we know all, right? We're all always learning, and when we know better, we do better, right? And so just because, and attending conversations like this so that we can collectively learn together is a big part of it. Coming together in community and saying, I'm not on my own here trying to figure out how to do this and how to be a welcoming, a truly inclusive and loving person. I'm part of a community that's all learning together how to do this, and then acknowledging when we mess up, when something comes up that we realize, oh, that's part of this wiring that I've got. And we recognize it, we apologize, and we do better, right? And so I think that's part of what I was trying to get at with the community agreements as well, is that we can all have those intentions that we aspire to those values that our church has put forth, and we don't always live into it. We don't always, in our words, our actions don't always align, and so when they don't, we hold ourselves accountable and each other accountable to growing together and doing better. So, for example, sometimes you might use the incorrect pronoun for someone. That's something that comes up often, and they might say, "Actually, I use, they, them pronouns." It's very easy to just say, "Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for letting me know," and then moving on. Sometimes, folks, when you mess up on a pronoun, can get so like, "Oh no, I did it. I did the wrong thing," right? And then like prolong the conversation in a way that's not necessary. It's just, "Oh, thank you for letting me know. I'm sorry. I actually know better, and I'm going to do better next time." Continue, right? More on that later. Becca, and then Jackie, and then Joe.
So I had a couple of thoughts, but one of the things that this conversation is reminding me of is when I first learned about Our Whole Lives, the OWL sexuality curriculum. And one of the foundations of that program is the idea that when you are immersed in a dominant culture, whatever that dominant culture is, to validate and support people who are not in that dominant culture, you need to heighten the elevation and the voice and the visibility. And so thinking about how we're doing, I would love to see us intentionally be raising those voices, be highlighting people in those communities, and making sure, so it's not necessarily one-on-one conversations, but it's making our community culture through our readings and the books that we do together and the songs that we sing and all of that. If that uplifts the trans, queer, non-binary community, then we're doing a better job. And then the very concrete thing that came to my mind this morning is our restrooms. And if I am non-binary, I don't know where I am welcome to use the bathroom in this building.
Thank you, Becca.
We missed out by just a couple of years. If it was a couple of years later, we would just have 2 bathrooms.
Right.
We used to just have to take the names off, just take the plaques off.
Could just take the plaques off, given the fact that the bathrooms are already separate, right, within the,
Question, what do you do with the one with the urinal?
could remove the urinal. Or,
Just leave it there.
you could just leave it there, right? Yep.
So, it makes me think I'm sitting here looking at our name tags, and none of us have pronouns on our name tags, and that seems like a pretty, easy fix. I know, that there's many voices that need to be heard about it, as well as many churches I drive by have a flag up front.
Pronouns, perhaps, one of the questions that Edwin asked was a great question. It might be uncomfortable to ask somebody, how do you identify? An easy way to make clear that it's a safe place, or to try and develop a sense of belonging for all folks on the gender spectrum, is just to say your pronouns, right? Everybody uses pronouns to refer to themselves, and so even if you're cis, you can put on your name tag, the pronouns that you use, and that just automatically just is a cue. It's a signal to say, you're welcome to share that with me, if you use different pronouns, right? So yes, and then Jackie, and then Joan.
I think they just need to practice, but I found it very challenging when I had a friend who was gender neutral, and I was in a threesome. I found it just difficult to remember to say they and them.
Yeah.
It takes practice. It's like you need 2 or 3 people to get together and just practice. Okay, you're going to be the person
Yep.
that's going to be gender neutral.
And that's totally normal, right? I mean, how many of us have had someone we know get married and their last name changes, and it takes a while to be like, oh, no, I mean, you know, and you got to practice saying their new name, right? And it's the same sort of thing, or a similar sort of thing, for just practicing, you know, using the correct name, the correct pronoun, to refer to our trans and non-binary friends and family. Joan, and then Mary.
Yeah, I think the more boxes we put people into, so that the traditions that have people, girls do this and boys do this, are where a lot of the really bad stuff happens. But I wanted to say another thing. We were in our book group. We were talking about how in France and in England they use the word one a lot. One goes to the, but we don't. And maybe we could start saying one. That might seem more. The other thing I really wanted to mention was in Lincoln Talk, a person who's doing the drag thing is named Velvet. And Velvet came out as Velvet. And someone very honestly said, would you please identify yourself? And several people wrote skillfully and not so skillfully how that was wrong. And then Velvet wrote a really lovely instruction piece, very kind. And I have been feeling, and I think of this when I'm in the car, not where I'm with my phone, but I want to write and thank Velvet, because I think our doing that kind of thing, being there for the person is really wonderful, really important, and not silent. So I'm going to write and say thank you for educating us and for being so kind when you do it. But I think we've got to, as individuals, do that kind of thing every chance we get.
Absolutely. Solidarity with somebody, so they're not by themselves saying the thing about themselves, right? If you're a cisgender, heterosexual person and you see that someone is being referred to, you hear that they're being referred to in a way that is not in alignment with their dignity, right? To be alongside them and to publicly uplift their voice, right?
This person said it was in a dangerous category.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's really important for us to write and thank them.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mary?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts, but I'm going to zero in on one. I'm so appreciative of the concept of spectrum, of gender spectrum. I think that if we're shocked by the idea of spectrum, we would do well to do some self-examination of our historical experience of our growing up, because the spectrum of gender
Thank you. Yes, Joan, and then Adam, and then I've got wrap up, Joan Mansell.
Sorry, Joan. So, I'm showing my age here, but, I speak as a proud tomboy. Basically, a girl who loved to do boyish things back when girls' roles were very, restricted. And now, if you look at the culture, you see the fantasy movies where the women are sort of the warrior princesses, and they're knocking out men in hand-to-hand combat and all these lovely fantasies. And there's much more wide acceptance of role, women in all kinds of professions and the army and so on, and men allow in all kinds of professions, but men may be accepted as nurses. So there's a wide spectrum of expansion of what's permission and roles, and yet at the same time there's the pronoun, which is like, okay, now we have to choose a pronoun, and that I struggle with the people putting themselves in boxes when the human experience is often for many people a spectrum,
And I think that last part is the key. For me, that's what stands out, is that the human experience is a spectrum. And for some folks, being a woman who is a tomboy is really important, and that's a way to understand oneself. In a similar way that being a trans man might be a more resonant way of understanding oneself. And so for folks there are plenty of folks out there that really are like, you know what, any pronoun is fine. I resonate with all of them, or I don't use them at all. That's one way of experiencing one's gender and feeling like it's fluid and not wanting to confine oneself to a box. And then for other people, the naming and the usage of a particular pronoun is really important and is really validating the way that they experience themselves internally. And that's how we honor them, by using the pronoun that they've asked us to use. So there's not one way to be trans, there's not one way to be cis, right? Someone might be a cis woman and experience femininity in one way or another way, and it's all a spectrum. And so I think that's the key, is to say, we're going to make sure however you identify, and however you then express that identity is welcome here, and we're going to respect the pronouns, we're going to respect the name, we're going to respect if it's important to you and how you understand yourself, then it will be important to us, and we will welcome that. Right? Open up the next phase of our conversation. You'll see here on the handout, did everybody get a new handout that just went around? Everybody got it, okay. Titled FPL Open and Welcoming Statement. You may or may not realize that First Parish in Lincoln in 1995 voted to become an open and welcoming congregation, which, as I said earlier, has a particular meaning in our two denominations. Our UCC denomination uses the phrase open and affirming to signify a congregation that has made the public commitment to be affirming of LGBTQ folks in life, in practice, in structures, etc. That's open and affirming. The UUA has a designation, welcoming congregation, which is a similar thing for their denomination. Seems to me that in 1995, the First Parish in Lincoln decided to smush together those two categories and come up with this phrase, open and welcoming, because we are very, very unique. Because we are non-binary. And so this resolution passed at the annual meeting in June of 1995. And you can take a look at that top half. Here it is up on the screen. It's also on the handout. Recognizing that lesbian, gay, and bisexual persons are often undervalued and discriminated against in society and in churches, we, the First Parish in Lincoln, affirm the importance of becoming an open and welcoming church, one that values the lives of all people without regard to sexual orientation. We, the people of the First Parish in Lincoln, resolve to welcome to our congregations and our lives the homosexual, bisexual individuals, couples, and families, to nurture an ongoing dialogue among persons of differing sexual orientations, to learn to respect experiences and perspectives of homosexual persons in church programs and religious education, and to offer full congregational and ministerial support to all persons regardless of sexual orientation, including celebration of life events such as baptisms, weddings, and memorial services. What an incredible commitment for this congregation to have made in 1995. I mean, that is something that a lot of congregations were trying to do at that time, to make a public statement, of public witness, and it's a great step that this church took. However, in 2023, looking at this text, do we see anything that is missing? Right. And do we have any after having this conversation, does anything stand out to us, right? I think so. I think we can acknowledge that while the statement was good in many ways, it did not include gender identity or expression. And so there has been a small group of folks that have been taking a look at this text from 1995 and saying, how can we expand this? How can we rework this in 2023 to be another statement of intent, right? A statement of public witness, particularly in a year with skyrocketing legislation that is against trans and non-binary folks. How can we make a statement of public witness of our intention to be an open and welcoming congregation for trans and non-binary folks? And so what we've done is we've put together this draft of a possible reworking of that resolution, and the parish committee has unanimously and enthusiastically affirmed this process of crafting this text. They've looked at this text and they've affirmed it, and they have affirmed the process of bringing this resolution before the congregation for a vote to make this our updated, open and welcoming statement to go in our bylaws. So, again, we are at the very last moments of this conversation, and so we can't dig into these particulars in the phrasing, etc. My encouragement to you would be to take a look at it. Reach out if you have any questions about the language and why it was used the way that it was. Let's continue the conversation. If we want to have another, in the next couple of weeks, conversation about it, we can plan another session. But our next follow-up session will be in 2 weeks, June 4th, which incidentally is Pride Sunday. We will meet again after worship to continue the conversation about how we can then live into this in our congregation, and particularly we'll dedicate the bulk of the time to looking at this text and saying, what does this text mean? Are we ready to make this commitment as a congregation? Do we want to make this commitment as a congregation? And if we, as the process continues, we will bring it to a vote either at the annual meeting on June 5th, the day after that forum, or if we feel we need to dig in a little bit more, we will continue to do so and call a special meeting. So that's kind of where we are at in the process of this right now. I encourage you to bring forward any questions you have about that as you feel so moved. Thank you all for being here.